Hello and welcome to another edition of Hypnosis Helps, the show that talks about hypnosis and how it helps. Also, we aim to dispel some of the myths that are commonly there about hypnosis and to help inform people who may wish to use hypnosis as a modality as to how it works, what it can do, what its limitations are, and generally how to determine whether hypnosis would benefit you. So on this particular edition, and probably on the next one too, we're going to be dealing with an old chestnut of hypnosis, smoking cessation. So I'm Neil Myers and my colleague Bill Miller here are going to be talking about that together. Now, outside of, if you ask anybody, have you seen hypnosis? Do you know anything about hypnosis? Have you been hypnotized? You may get some people that say that they watched a stage show, and probably the next one of two things that they'll talk about, either using hypnosis for weight loss, which we're going to be talking about in other programs too, but probably the single most common one is smoking cessation. When people think of hypnosis for therapeutic reasons, they're thinking primarily about hypnosis for smoking cessation.
Right.
And whilst hypnosis for smoking cessation is not the focus of my practice, like almost every other hypnosis practitioner probably in the country, I offer sessions for smoking cessation. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So Bill, what's you...
Right. So what I'm going to start out by is just kind of throwing out a series of statements and then questions, and then ask you and of course myself, we'll address those, but just to kind of set the stage. Mm-hmm. First one is, quitting smoking seems to be easier for some people than others. And the question is, well, why is that? Why do some people, you'll see them, they could use nicotine patches or whatever, and they quit, and others, it doesn't make any difference to them. And the other thing to say is that nicotine is widely viewed, and we'll talk about that, as an addictive substance. But, the question is, well, do some people become more addicted than others? Mm. Is that the reason what makes some, it's easier to quit for some than others? And we'll address that, and we'll talk about that. But the thing is, let's just assume that it is physically addictive, mm-hmm. right? If you look at that, well, the addiction part of quitting really is only a few days long.
Yes.
Because the chemicals out of the bloodstream and so forth. But if you look at people and talk to people who've quit smoking, months go by and they are still struggling with that urge to quit smoking. Yeah. And it really at that point can't be nicotine, mm-hmm. even if you believe it's addictive and all that stuff. And so there's got to be something more to it.
Yeah, and that's I think that's very well put, and it's a good place to start. So just talking about, I suppose, one of that, we've probably all heard something to the effect, whether we're smokers or have been smokers or know smokers, that nicotine is amongst the most addictive substances known to man, more addictive than crack cocaine, more rapidly acting on the brain. And certainly nicotine is a very, very poisonous substance. Hmm. I think a thimbleful can kill a horse. I mean, you don't need very much. Unfortunately, there are only tiny amounts in cigarettes. Of course, mm-hmm. they do build up over time,
right? And
they do cause numerous health issues. Of that, there's no doubt, and there's decades of research to support that. Even though some people still deny that's the case, but that's okay. So then the question becomes: is it the addictive factor? Because I think one of the things that has become popular with when people talk about smoking cessation is to view it as a form of addiction. And I want to, you and I hold slightly different
yeah,
opinions
exactly.
on this.
We'll get to that, yeah.
So my opinion is that if nicotine is addictive, it's not nearly as addictive as people believe it to be. And the reason I say that is because if it was, then I believe that people would be coming to me and other people that do similar work with addictions connected with the nicotine patch or nicotine gum.
Right.
And I have never had anybody come to me saying, well, I'm addicted to the nicotine patch or I can't stop chewing the gum.
Right.
And I don't know of any hypnosis colleague who that's ever happened to.
Right. So you go
sceptical.
ahead, finish. Yeah.
I'm sceptical about that. And again, let's just take the hypothesis that it is an addictive substance. Let's just take that. As you so correctly stated, that the nature of it is it's a short-lived addiction. The physical the chemicals out of the blood in 3 days, I think. Yeah. So the question is what happens afterwards.
see that, and that's the real point. And just to emphasize that, as you know, I myself am a former smoker, and I was a heavy smoker. I was 2 packs a day.
Yep.
And I went from 2 packs a day to 0 in one night. And I did it with willpower, which I don't recommend. It was the toughest.
This is before you knew anything about
hypnosis. Many years ago, thankfully. But it was really one of the toughest things I've ever done. But the fact is, even going from that high dose of nicotine to 0 in one day, I myself believe it is addictive, but it's not as addictive as it might be made out to be. Because I noticed 3 days in, and you cite that was actually my experience. 3 days in, and I could just feel that pull of whatever it is inside, that addictive thing, just went away.
Yeah.
My desire to smoke didn't.
Right.
And it had to do with other things that were there, and that went on for months and months.
Yeah.
So if you look at that, and then I actually have another personal situation. My daughter's a smoker, and I'm hoping she'll quit, use our program. And she told me recently she quit smoking. She did do like the nicotine patch, or gum, and they have a step down program that occurs over weeks. She got a little ways into it and said, "Oh, to heck with this." And she just dropped it to 0 real fast. She didn't notice any difference. And she says, "Yeah, a day or two," and then it was over. Yet months later, she still started smoking again.
Right.
So I believe it's addictive, but not anywhere near. And really, in my opinion, what really drives smokers is something other than that.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, one of the things I ask all smokers are standard questions, to which you can ask folks, any smoker, if you smoke or if you know of a smoker, just ask them these 2 questions. If you could go back to the day before you smoked, or the time when you first started smoking, knowing everything that you know now, however old you were, whether it was 10 or 15 or 20 or whatever the age, would you recommend that young person that you were begin smoking? Right. And I encountered one smoker in my life that said, well, yes, but there was a whole series of complex reasons for that. But just about every other smoker I've ever asked whether they want to stop, or even if they're continuing to smoke, say no. Right. And then the next question you ask smokers is the simple question, do you recommend that your children or grandchildren start smoking? Right. And they all look at you in horror and say, no, of course not, that would be absurd. Why would I
exactly. They
recommend
look like it's ridiculous.
So all smokers know that it's unhealthy. All smokers know that it's not a habit that they want others close to them, loved ones, to start or continue. Right. So I don't spend a lot of my time focusing on those elements of it, because that's really pushing against an open door. They know that already. Right. The real question is, why do people continue to smoke? Right,
that's the question. That's the essential question.
Right, and for me, there's a twofold answer to that, and I think every smoker out there is going to recognise both parts that I'm going to mention. One part is that there is an emotional reason why people smoke, and it's not always a single reason. It may be because they believe, even though they know physically that it's not true, that they believe that smoking reduces their anxiety. It calms them, or it rewards them, or it's something that they want to do in a social situation.
And we're going to talk about why it may feel calming, even though it's a stimulant and so forth. There are reasons that we know of for that, so we'll get into that. Yeah.
Hypnotically, yeah.
Right, exactly.
And then, I remember somebody saying to me one time who had tried a program of hypnosis, not mine, but a different one, and it had worked for a short period of time, but not permanently. Right. And she came to me and she said, well, one of the things that I found is that for me, smoking a cigarette at the end of a meal indicated the meal was over. Right. Therefore, I can stop eating. Well, when I wasn't smoking, there was no cessation. There was no of eating. Right. Right. There was no signal that the meal was over. So very often, smoking becomes linked to feelings of satisfaction following the end of a meal, or comfort on a coffee break or at a break from work. Right. You know, now it's the case that almost nobody, it seems, is allowed to smoke at work. So you see people sheltering the rain in the downstairs lobbies or outside of office buildings smoking a cigarette. It's
and you know, and one of the things that you mentioned, just to really make sure it pointed out for the audience, is that when you say it gets linked to satiety at the end of a meal, it's basically, by having it then, it links it to good feelings.
Absolutely.
The coffee break, okay, I got away from work for a few minutes.
Right.
Oh, I can just let my brain go down. So they're actually linking it with positive things. So when they go to quit, well, they're taking away something that's
right.
quote unquote positive.
Right, and one can't, you know, one must never diminish the importance of these factors or believe that they can be just dismissed with a cursory, oh, well, you know, you'll find a different way, because one has to recognise, and we, you know, in our program we do recognise that. And that's one aspect. The second major reason is a fairly simple one, but it's that it's a habit.
Right.
And, you know, if one considers, let's say, and you can help me with the math a little bit here, but let's say an individual has been smoking a pack a day for 40 years.
Right.
You know, that means that what's in a pack? 20 cigarettes.
20 cigarettes.
So how many cigarettes is that over the course of 1 year?
A pack a day. That's 20 cigarettes times 365. Right. You got 7,000 cigarettes.
Right. So 7,000 cigarettes. Let's multiply
times
that
40.
40.
292,000 cigarettes.
292,000 cigarettes. Now, again, folks, I have a confession to make. I'd never smoked. So, Bill, as a former smoker, about how many times do you take a drag, take a puff?
Well,
each cigarette.
Each cigarette.
Average.
Oh, I don't know. Probably 10 times, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's say 10. It's an easy calculation.
So now you got 2 million.
Right.
Right.
So what does that mean, folks? That means if somebody's been smoking 40 years, let's say half it, let's say 20 years, 1 million times they've made a movement bringing the cigarette to their mouth. 1 million times.
Right.
And 1 million times that is associated very frequently with some relief from an emotion. Now consider that as an ingrained habit, just as a physical habit. Imagine that we asked you, for example, to stop because it was a bad habit, not that it is.
Right.
You know, using your right hand to spoon food into your mouth. Consider how difficult that would be in and of itself. However much you may be willing to do so because you believe there was some social merit in not doing it that way. But now we're talking about smoking. So we're talking about a habit that's physically ingrained, maybe 1 million movements that you've made over the course of the years. And what you're asking us to do as hypnosis practitioners is to sever that habit in a few minutes.
Right, in minutes, exactly, yeah.
Which is something that you've ingrained for years and years and years. Now, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is that because it's a habit, it does require, there's a period of time where there's a change to that habit. Mm-hmm. The good news is using the techniques and methods that we use, you can greatly shorten that cycle. And what you were describing with your own experience of stopping via willpower, is that there's really nothing to counteract the force of that habit linked to that emotion except willpower. And we know from the hypnotic model that willpower, being in the seat of the conscious mind, is a rather weak force by comparison to the power of the subconscious mind, which is saying to you, you're going to feel so much better when you have a cigarette.
Right.
You know, all that feelings of tension, emotion are going to go away. And the willpower part's like, no, you can't, you mustn't, it's not healthy, it's not good for you. And in the battle between those two, frequently the one's going to win out until that habit's over. And sometimes it takes a long time. Now there is something I just wanted to mention before I forget. There is something that is quite addictive in cigarettes. Sugar. Every cigarette contains sugar. Most smokers don't know that. I didn't know that. But sugar is quite a problem. For those of you that are old enough to remember, there was a TV character called Kojak, a policeman who was very popular. It was a very popular TV show in my country, England. What was it, in the 80s or something, I suppose?
Probably.
And he was often sucking a lollipop. And why was he sucking a lollipop? Well, in the show, he was trying to stop smoking, and he was using that as I suppose, an oral replacement for that.
Right, right.
But I believe in real life, the actor Telly Savalas, who was himself a heavy smoker, was at various times attempting to stop.
Right.
And the way he would do it was by putting that in his mouth. And I think he thought he was just addressing the oral, need, but there's also a sugar that's going on there.
Yeah, and I will say a couple things about it. As I was a 2-pack a day smoker, and so when you talk about habit, that meant that basically every 20 minutes or a little bit more, I was lighting up. I'm smoking for 5 minutes a cigarette, so I'm spending every hour 15 minutes of it, a quarter of my day, smoking. So and like you say, so many puffs. So you have all those habits. When I went to quit by willpower, it was crazy because I had to substitute something. What did I do? I put my head in the refrigerator and kept eating. And I actually gained 5 pounds a week for the first 4 weeks.
Wow.
And then after that, it got a little bit easier and I gained another 10 pounds. But the fact is, I knew it was replacing, I need to do something because for 4 years nonstop, every time as long as I was awake during the day, I'm doing something every few minutes orally.
Right.
And so it was a substitute. Unfortunately, it was much healthier. If that's my only choice, willpower and gain some weight, good choice compared to smoking.
Right.
But with these processes, you don't need to go through that.
No, and one of the things is I can honestly say I don't know of any person on the smoking cessation programs that I use who stopped smoking and then went on to gain weight. Part of the reason for that is that we shatter the link between those two in the process.
Right.
But the idea that if you stop you must gain weight is just not true.
And that's really important because that is kind of a truism for a lot of other type of methods, willpower and things like that. That because you're not addressing the habit, real down in the subconscious is that you might gain weight simply to satisfy the oral part of it.
Right.
But with this, you don't have that.
No.
Yeah. So that's yep.
Right.
So anyways, yep.
So
you want to talk about options?
Yeah. Well, one of
like
the
if
things,
you decided to you've been smoking and you've decided to quit.
Right. So I mean, if you make the decision to quit, then you're faced with it. And let's talk about the non-hypnotic options, as
Right.
it were. First of all, of course, there's just conventional willpower, by which I mean you just make the decision to stop. And there's no doubt some people stop that way.
Right.
My father, it turned out that my uncle, back in the late 50s and then early 60s, was one of the people actually in the United Kingdom who was first involved in the research between the connection between smoking and lung cancer. And sometime, I believe, in the late 50s or possibly early 60s, he said to my father, whose name was Benny, he said, Benny, we think there's a link. And my father was surprised and he said, oh, okay. And then approximately 1961, 62, he said, we're almost completely certain there's a link between smoking and lung cancer. You should stop. So my father said, okay, that's it. And he told me that he put his classic thing, he put his cigarettes on the mantelpiece and he said, they're going to rot before I take them. And they literally rotted away. Or just, whatever they do after a long period of time. And that was it. But very, very few people can do that.
And that's it's a good thing you say, well, what made me able to do it willpower? It actually was something similar because nowadays everybody knows that it causes cancer and so forth. So somebody comes into us and says, well, it's unhealthy. Well, that's actually not they know that already. They've known that all while they're smoking. So is that really gives them enough impetus to do it or not? In my case, it was because people always saw me chain smoking and said, well, you never cough.
Right.
Yeah, and I used to say, oh, it never doesn't bother me, right? And then one day I coughed. And the next day I coughed. And it didn't stop.
Yeah.
And I finally went,
call.
This physical thing, it's bothering me, and I could see it in myself. And that's actually what caused me to quit, because I said, it's going to get me. And I had physical evidence.
So in a short while, folks, we're going to talk about the social context of smoking as well, because that's very, very important, even hypnotically. But yeah, that's true. I mean, to my father in the 1960s, it was really news. But when people tell me these days, and they call me up and they say, well, I want to stop smoking, and I have a filtration process.
Right.
And I say, well, why? And one of the first things a lot of people say, oh, well, it's unhealthy. And I say, well, how long have you been smoking? And they'll say 20 years. And I say, you just found out. Because
exactly.
Clearly that's not the primary reason anymore, because everybody knows these days, unless you're in complete denial, that it's unhealthy.
Right.
But that wasn't the case in the 1930s, 40s, 50s,
Right.
60s. That was not the case.
Right.
So and we're going to talk about that because that's important in a second. But talking about, so there's willpower as one option. There is the nicotine patch. There's the nicotine gum. And these have varying degrees of effectiveness. Although over long-term studies, I don't think the effectiveness goes above, after a year, I think 7 to 10% of people that use those methods actually are still not smoking after
Right.
1 year.
Right.
Most of the studies that are published on those really only measure it after a few weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 7 weeks, which gives rather flattering results.
Yeah, and the fact is that if you assume it is an addiction, well, the addiction doesn't last that long anyways.
Right.
So nicotine patch would not be useful after the first short while.
Correct. And, and then, of course, there's the more extreme things, mind-altering drugs like Chantix, which alters the mood, and apparently, on some people, it helps them stop smoking. Of course, it has a tremendous number of side effects as a result of doing that. It's truly a mind-altering, very powerful drug. And once again, the people that market Chantix tend to measure their results after a period of 8 weeks, in which it looks quite flattering, about 40%, I believe. You measure it beyond that, and it starts to get a whole lot less. My understanding is that studies that have looked at it over a year, it's closer to 14%. And again, so one's faced with, yes, one stopped smoking, but one's had to use a mind-altering drug, and
Right.
for the vast majority of people, it's not going to work.
Right.
So,
and the other thing I will bring up is because we're talking about options, and there are hypnosis programs,
yes.
and we're going to talk about those for a second. And some of those I've read that they said, yeah, they've done the same thing where they measured the success over 2 or 3 months. They didn't measure the success a year out.
right,
And
at least a year. Yeah.
Right, and that's the thing is that some of those, the reports that they aren't effective a year out, and we'll
Right.
talk about why that is exactly.
Right.
But other options that we want to think about.
Well, I know that there are various herbal. Some people try homeopathic programs and remedies, and it's my belief that, one's at a certain point dealing with placebo. At a certain point, almost anything will work. If you're determined enough that you want to smoke, and you just need a placebo effect to tell you that's going to happen, and somebody gives you a pill of bread and sugar or whatever it might be,
Right.
that might be enough. And again, I don't even criticise that per se. It's just one's looking at trying to answer the question: what's the most effective? What are my options? And what's going to have me become a permanent non-smoker? See, that's
Right.
the goal of my programs. Is not for people to stop for a short time, and a short can be defined as a few days or a few months or even a few years. But what's going to result in them stopping permanently?
Right.
Right.
So one of the things that, and I'm not sure if we quite hit it, but we talk about, it actually may be slightly different for some people versus others.
Oh yeah, certainly.
Some maybe it's just, if you believe that it's addictive, they have a little bit of addictive component, they have a habit component, and so forth. But for others, it's really linked to something down in their subconscious, to a feeling of safety and so forth. And so they're really being kind of driven, even though it's not a safe thing, their subconscious may think it's safe for various reasons.
Yes.
And so in those cases, in a simple addiction case, or something like that, maybe a regular direct suggestion hypnosis program might work.
Yes. Yes.
But when you think if it's connected to feelings of safety and so forth like that, I'm going to pass it back to you to talk about how that could get imbued in an individual.
So,
but they might need a different program like the one we use.
Yes, and so I actually have 2 programs, and I make a distinction between whether people are going to go into one or the other. Now, I have to say that the vast majority of people, probably upwards of 90%, go in the first program.
Right.
And but here's what I'm looking for. I'm looking to see if there is any very deep emotional link between smoking and their lives. And if there is, I know that the program that the vast majority of people use successfully is probably not going to work for them, and I'll tell them that. And let me give you an example, if I may.
Go ahead. I was going to throw out an example that I know.
So yeah. I had one gentleman a number of years ago, and he'd been to other hypnosis practitioners, and I think he was very sincere about wanting to stop, but nothing had been successful for him. And I asked him a question that I always ask, which is, when did you begin smoking? And his answer surprised me, because he said, I was 5 years old. Now, folks, I don't know if anybody out there started smoking when they were 5 years old. That's quite rare these days. You often find people that began when they were 8 or 9. Most frequently, what I'm finding is people start sometime between about 13 and 18, usually as a result of friends and encouraging them to smoke, or their peer group.
Right.
But this is a very unusual answer. And so I asked him the next question, which was, who was the person that introduced you to smoking? Now, I thought he was going to say possibly an older sibling or a cousin or a friend. And he said, my mother. And those two answers alone told me that it was very, very unlikely that he was going to be successful with my ordinary program.
Right.
Because there was and as I explored a little further, it was very clear that for him to be accepted into the family, even at 5 years old, smoking was a part of that.
Right.
And his mother was saying, you want to be part of this family, here's a cigarette.
Right.
And that was such a powerful message. It remains such a powerful message of the need of belonging and security and safety, that my regular program was not going to be effective with that.
Would not work. And I had a very similar case. I had a client whose husband wanted to quit smoking, and he went to a direct suggestion type of hypnotist, and I said, oh, that's great. This is before I had talked to her and so forth. If she had taken a second to talk to me and told me some of the information I found out later, I could have told her not to even bother with that. Because what it was is that he too was started, I don't know if his mother started him, but at a very young age, not as early as that, she would smoke with him all the time. And when I asked a few more questions, he actually said to his wife, and who translated it to me, said, well, if I give it up, it's my whole identity. And so you look at it, can you easily just say, oh, I don't even know who I am anymore, I give up my whole identity to quit. So for him, quitting was giving up himself. Right. And that's just something that direct suggestion hypnosis just can't deal with. No, and that's why you have the other program. Right.
And I will say that for people who are sincere and who want to stop, the program that I have that involves that is more involved, because they're going to have to deal with the deep feelings, emotions and sensations. It's more expensive as well, because there's more work required. It's effective. And I also have to say that for the vast majority of people, for them to stop smoking, it's not necessary to do a program of that level.